Right. In the last panel, we heard a lot of big numbers, billions and trillions. Julie was talking about the B and the T. And this is the case, if we're thinking about the world and the amount of work we have to do, we have to think about those enormous scales. And so this is a conversation about scaling. How do we take ideas so they go from an innovation to being something really massive? And it is the case that in the social sector, traditionally, scale has been a problem. That even, no matter how good a non-profit is, it really scales to a massive size. And ideas still don't always flow so well across borders. What can we do that? What are the challenges to scaling? How can we make scaling more effective? We've got 4 fantastic people to discuss this with us. Sid Espinosa from Microsoft, Laura Abadia from JPAL, and Rafal Rudzki from Deloitte. And leading us through this conversation, I'm slightly worried she's going to get headhunted for her own talk show, Ladan Manteghi from SPI. Welcome.
Well, considering that we have been upstaged by the rock stars of the last session, I decided to change my hair and put my rock star hair on today instead of my academic hair from yesterday. So, welcome back, everyone. Lunch was great, wasn't it? Yeah. Just, it's not nap time yet, so please stay awake. You'll be rewarded with cookies afterwards, after we make them work and us work for a bit. So, I want to ask, Rafal, how would you define scale? When it comes to scaling that which one would think would work, because scaling doesn't always, what are the important ingredients?
Thank you for raising this question. It's quite a difficult one, that's for sure. When you think about the scaling up as a complex matter, even going back to the discussion about the impact investments, as we can see and what we've heard is that money is not enough. So we need not only kind of understanding of the issue, we need only kind of resources to do it, but also willingness. And this is on both sides, on the governmental side and also on the business side. And very often when we work as a Deloitte servicing those 2 major players that may bring definitely the change to societies, but also very often they are linked with the economy. So I would say that defining the right priorities is the very, very important starting point, and SPI, the framework, specific indicators are very often very instrumental in that.
Defining the priorities. So, Sid Espinosa, you have worn the 2 hats that Rafal just referred to. You're the former mayor of Palo Alto, California. You are now with Microsoft in the business sector. Tell us from both vantage points, right? From both sides of the coin. When you were mayor, what were you looking for, and where were you looking for examples where you could perhaps transfer models to then replicate? And now, as a business executive at Microsoft, what are those factors that you're looking for in terms of building out those best examples that have been piloted and that at a larger scale can succeed?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me and having this conversation. I think it's, one of the things that's really interesting coming out of a conference like this is that we have people who are practitioners in the room who get it, right? Who are already thinking about the fact that this is important work and that have already bought into it. When we're talking, I think, in this room about going outside back to our cities and our countries, our businesses and nonprofits and universities and government agencies, and thinking about sharing that or scaling it or taking to other cities, it's a whole different set of questions that we need to start thinking about and working on. I'll start to answer your question, the second part of that. So in philanthropy, at least is the way we think about it at Microsoft, which is what I lead, and we'll do about $1.5 billion in investments this year in nonprofits and schools around the world. One of the first things that's most important is context. What we do in terms of investment and scaling in Botswana versus Cambodia versus East Baltimore is fundamentally different. Secondly, you're really thinking about there are different models for scaling. There's different ways to think about. But in general, in philanthropy, what we're thinking about is solving a social problem, looking at what's working in a cultural or a community context, and then thinking about how we can scale that to a bunch of other folks. So just an example, in East Palo Alto, next to where I live, we're looking at improving graduation rates in high school. We're looking then at programs that are actually working in a school, and then what are the factors for scaling that? If we're going to take it someplace else, is it the leadership that's important? Is it the curriculum that's there? Is it who's coming to the table? Is it the funding? Like, what are all of those components for scale? And I think there's a whole process, and there are different ways to go about that. But as a community here, I think where we are in sort of the development and the growth of the index, it'll be interesting to think about the conversation about scale. Is it something that's sort of organized from the top down? Are we just showing a system that works and thinking about who gets it and runs with it in different countries? Is this something that we should be more aggressive about scaling and growing? And part of that is thinking about the model that works. What models, and there are many, again, work in scaling, and how do you do that? Just to answer the second part of really the first part of that question, secondly, as mayor, I think we are, well, there's an expression in the United States that all politics is local, and you're very much thinking about your community, how it can be as healthy and vibrant, a lot of what the index looks at, right? How you ensure sort of basic needs, but also opportunity for everybody. And as you're thinking about how to get things done and how to scale what's working, you're looking at best practices, which I think is something else that we should be talking about. And you're thinking about what's applicable to your community and what's the cost benefit and how you can bring the right people around the table to make something happen. So I think it's, there's a process that you have to think through that includes politics, that includes other factors beyond just sort of what the data might show.
Okay, so in beyond the data, there are the intangibles that you have to factor in as well. Last year, at a conference around oceans, there was a keynote speaker that we had, and this is not at SPI, this is in my previous incarnation. And the gentleman said, scale is the death knell of sustainability. So, Laura, is this true?
I would say yes.
So scale is better, it will kill sustainability? It's better to be local?
No, sorry. I think scale, when you're thinking about scale, you should definitely think about models that are sustainable in reaching many more people. So,
okay. So the opposite. Yeah.
Yes, I think sustainability is a key ingredient when you want to design systems that can be scaled up. It should be definitely taken into account.
Okay. Now, in your work, you basically look at what are examples for your clients where there are the opportunities for investment, for growth, for truly making a mark. How do you do the evaluation of those endeavors, whether they've already made initial pilot investments or they're saying, figure out what's out there that we can make that difference to go from that small, testing ground to something that's bigger that we can really put our imprimatur on? How do you evaluate?
Yeah, so just to answer your question, I will give a little bit of background about the organization I'm working for. So the Poverty Action Lab was founded on the belief that, we know we have all these tools to identify the problems that exist. Once we have identified these problems, we don't know what works well and why. What are the solutions? So researchers are testing very rigorously the impact of these solutions, and generally they're testing these solutions at a relatively small scale. Then we have a rigorous measure of the impact. We know whether this is working, and we know whether it's working well and why. What are the key ingredients? So I would say the first step in identifying a model that can be right for scale is having this rigorous evidence about the impact and understanding what were the mechanisms that led us there. So this is the way the organization is thinking about what should we pushing as promising innovations or ideas? And when I'm talking about innovation, it can be very simple things.
Like what? I mean, what's a simple thing? Because I think a lot of times with innovation, we think technological, something complicated. You're saying it can be simple. What's simple?
It can be very simple. So to give you an example, in developing countries, a big part of the population don't have access to clean water. And this has many consequences in health. And diarrhea is, for example, one of the leading causes of child mortality. So we might think about complicated water technologies, but we tested a solution that's basically a chlorine dispenser. It's a very simple blue plastic dispenser we put in the middle of the community. People are seeing other people using it. It's convenient, it's easy to use, and this actually improved significantly the cleanness of the water the community had access to. So it's very simple. We evaluated, we tested the impact, we could quantify it scientifically, and now it has been being scaled up in several countries in East Africa.
Now, but what does that mean it's being scaled up? So you got this blue thing that you put out there. How do you put it in these other places, and how do you know that it's going to work in all these other venues?
So yeah, you need to know whether it's going to work. You need to know very well whether the context is similar to the one where you evaluated it. So whether we have high prevalence of, diseases, waterborne diseases, whether communities go to a specific spot to take water, is this social cultural practice similar? And then how is it being scaled up? We're working with an organization called Evidence Aid that's helping with all the logistics and helping to talk to governments to put all these very simple technologies in communities.
So you use this in Africa. Would it work in Flint, Michigan, where they're having water issues?
I don't know Michigan. I would say no, because people are not going to collect water to a central place. You have your tap water at home. So no, I would say this solution wouldn't be adapted.
Okay, well, yes.
Can
Rafal?
I add two more ingredients which are very much related to what you just said about Microsoft experience? And actually, we had a chance to work with one of the branches in the Central Europe, and two more very important aspects of making sure that your activities that are impacting society or communities you work in, and also bring the business value, because that's one of the drivers for the corporate environment to take an action. So first of all is stakeholder engagement. So with your old citizenship strategy, so how Microsoft acts towards the changing the communities it operates with. One of the branches went into the really profound stakeholder dialogue to define priorities for their activities, but they were very much related to their core business, which was connectivity, which was the skills that are required for the new knowledge-based economy. So very much business-oriented goals, but then results were delivered to society itself. So stakeholder engagement, so getting insights from, making sure that the grounds for the scaling is kind of recognized, and then having those priorities very close to the business. So thinking about sustainable business and bringing value in the long term, then you need to think also on the business returns.
And if I may, I think that I totally agree, and there's, I think, a secondary component, and just stay with me as I give this example for just a second. At Microsoft, we, our employee giving program, so we give every employee at the company $15,000 a year, all those in the United States, $15,000 a year to where we'll match their donations to nonprofits. So they give $1,000 to a nonprofit or a 501c3 NGO, we will match that up to $15,000 a year. And last year that was $144 million, not our philanthropic strategic priorities, but employee giving in the match. An incredible amount of money that goes out there. When I came into the company, though, the participation rate, so lots of tech companies have these types of programs, the participation rate for employees tends to be about 25 to 30%. So here you have 70% of employees who have this bucket of money who just don't use it every year, which is a horrible amount of money left on the table that could be helping NGOs. And so part of the dream, the scale fantasy that the company has, what if we increase that? If you just increase that by 5 percentage points, you could millions more dollars will go out into the community. And so over a few years, we started about 50%. We raised that to 65%, 70, 75%, 80. This last year was 85% of employees participating, which is a massive transformation. And again, it's moving capital in a way that is transformative. But the way that we did that is what's interesting, because there were, and all the other tech companies have been asking, sort of like, help us learn. And what we learned really clearly was that there are such different incentives for engagement. In that example, there are some people who will give because it's data-driven and they know there's an ROI on that investment and they know it's the smartest spend of their money to help a community problem. Some people need the emotional attachment. That's what's going to get them engaged. Some, it's a boss coming and saying, this is voluntary, but I really hope that everyone participates and there's 100% participation, right? Some, it's competition. They see another group doing it and they want to engage. And I think there's so many lessons in that for the type of scaling we're talking about. Because in some places, there might be regions where there are countries that view in a competitive way another country, and if they're engaged with the index and doing this work, and they're seeing that they're ranked differently, that will drive engagement. For some, there might be a leader who's very data-driven and who sees that this is work that is critically important for their community and can really have an impact and wants to understand those best practices. I think, so to your point, I think what's interesting is not just the stakeholder engagement, but really thinking about the incentives that will bring each of those actors to the table. Because if nothing else, I think we've seen in these dialogues that addressing any of these problems really takes cross-sector collaboration. You need academia and nonprofits and the business community, startups, government, et cetera, coming to the table to talk about these issues as a community and think about how to solve them. And in that dialogue, I think you have to recognize there are such different incentives for people to engage and want to participate and want to partner and see this thing through over the longer term. And for folks who can't see that cross-sector thread, I think they'll have a very difficult time thinking about then how you lead through scaling.
This is a really interesting set of points here, because earlier today and also yesterday in a separate conversation, there was some discussion about, all right, in this conference we've been talking about what works, but the focus has been really around the index, the index, the index. But what do we do with it? How does this turn into action? And typically, action seems to be translated as, okay, once you identify what those priorities are, then it's investment. It's money that needs to happen to make the impact. You all just gave examples that had nothing to do with money. Not that money isn't a factor, because we still want to mobilize money. But this was behavior change. All of what you talked about was behavior change. Policy is another lever as well. So money, policy, behavior change. And those are the impact factors, it seems. Now, Rafal, we were talking a little bit earlier, and I think particularly as it relates to impact investing, one of the things that in work that I've done previously as well, and I think we touched on it very briefly in the last session, is for impact investing to scale, one of the triggers or the blockages has been policy, and with unintended consequences of older policies that have existed, and elimination of policy in order to get that to scale. But then policy can also be replicated. Have you been working in realms as well where you've had to deal with, how do you scale things, or how do you trigger policy to be able to open the floodgates to make something happen?
I will give you one example that we just worked with the Polish government, and hopefully I'll ask Kate to refer to the great example of real change being brought to Cyprus. But let's focus on the Polish case. Very recently we were asked by the Polish Ministry of Development to take a snapshot where they are as a government, as a country, in terms of the objectives set by the Sustainable Development Goals. Not an easy task to do. So we used our sustainability skills, macroeconomical analysis skills to try to investigate what's important. And obviously then you get into the discussion that certain recommendations and priorities needs to be put, then would probably turn into policy and then instruments to make things going. So you may think that, okay, the government needs to take an action. Actually, business organization, they expect government to set a context in which they can take an action and really prove that they contribute to the achievement of specific goals. So on the one hand side, there is kind of a dilemma whether the government should really overreact and create the frameworks, the policies to drive activities around specific either challenges or bridging the gaps when it comes to the social or economic development. On the other hand side, we are saying that certain things are too complex to be solved by the one agency or the one firm. But then you need to think about, and probably that's yet another ingredient to scaling, about how you successfully collaborate and cooperate and really solve issues like education or health matters, which are cross-functional, cross-sectoral, and really requires the effort. So there is no one answer to that. So on one hand side, you need to have a policy. On the other hand side, you need the freedom to act.
Can I answer to that same question?
Yes,
Sure.
absolutely. Jump in.
Can I jump
No
in?
holds
Yeah.
barred here.
So, yeah, when thinking about the ingredients to scale, I would like to talk about a story in education. So, you know, this story is in India. Many of the children going to primary school, they leave primary school without knowing how to read or do a basic mathematical operation, which is very worrisome because this will hamper their success in the labor market and later in life. So there is this big NGO called Pratham, and they decided to test an innovation, in the sense simple innovation, by saying we should group these kids by level, teach them according to their own level these skills they need. They did this with volunteers. It worked very, very well. The evaluation showed it had an amazing impact in what they were learning. Now they said, with this evidence, we would like to scale it up so many more children in India can benefit from this. But how do we scale it up? So researchers said we should test the model using public schools, using teachers, to see whether it works. So they did a set of testing. They varied how it was delivered until they found a good model that could work through government schools, through teachers. And using this evidence, other countries in West Africa, Ghana, Zambia, today Burkina Faso, said, wow, this seems amazing. It works through government school. It's not very expensive. We should also try it out in our context. So I would add as an ingredient to scale up evidence, which, we say, now we're in the post-fact politics, no one hears about it, but we still find that it's very compelling to get funds from donors and to get governments interested in an approach. So I would add that as an extra ingredient.
And actually have the CEOs and the boards of the companies and the business environment to have the evidence that their investments brings social and business benefits. And
But why does that matter? Why is it that at the CEO level it would matter? I mean, decisions are held at different levels.
Yeah, definitely. But when you think about the involvement of large enterprises into changing their business environments, obviously that relates also to the social matters and their long-term strategies. So all the aspects that we've been discussing over the past 2 days are somehow related to their prospects, business prospects into the future. So definitely we should really raise this agenda, bring the arguments, so-called business case for all the activities that are related to sustainability and the societal change to the board level, because through those decisions, they really create the environment in which their businesses may last and actually be profitable and sustainable in the long term. So the CEOs and kind of a capital market education, we've had a discussion about the ESG factors and how they really impact the quality of portfolio being managed by the equity houses or other investments. And there is a huge gap and a need for making sure that they understand that it's not only, we said GDP will here profit, but then you need to just take beyond the discussion beyond this point. Yeah.
Sid, when we were talking last week about the session, you also mentioned leadership being important. So Rafal's talking about leadership at a CEO level when a program or an endeavor is held within an organization, you're trying to make it, more widespread. But I think you were talking in terms of when you find a nugget, whether it's a small organization that's doing something successfully and they want to make it bigger, that leadership matters. Why does that matter, and what else is needed? And have you had to deal with that in some fashion? You can tell us a story about it.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I think it's critically important. We deal with it on all sorts of levels. I will, though, I think, I'm going to answer it in two ways. I think that leadership comes in many different forms, and I think that the kind of leadership that might be needed by this and our community here to think about scale is a really interesting thing to touch on, that I'll touch on second. First, and again, not so surprising since I'm from the United States and we have this sort of individual exceptionalism that we breed in our children, that it's not so surprising that everyone can be president. You're told that from the time you're a kid. So we tend to think about leadership.
I tried, but I can't. I got as far as school president, and then I was told you're not a citizen.
There's a great movie
born
out
here.
there. There's a great movie from a few years back, Darfur Now, if anybody has seen that follows a lawyer working on war crime tribunals, Don Cheadle, an actor using his fame, et cetera, that are thinking about this issue. And it follows as well this cook working in a restaurant in Los Angeles who learns more about these issues and focuses on divestment. And he says, I just learned and I really care about this. And he starts flying himself up to the state capitol and lobbying. I mean, just sort of going door to door on divestment. And the movie ends with him with the governor signing legislation where the state is gonna, and really having just made this his cause. I think leadership comes in a whole bunch of different forms. It doesn't have to be it doesn't necessarily have to be the CEO or it can come at a bunch of different levels. But I think in this context of what we've been talking about, what we've seen is that we've sort of developed a system here where we have indices and a matrix that we know works, and we're studying and making sure it's the right things to look at to really see systemic change in a community related to basic needs and well-being and opportunity. And we think this is the right thing to do. And the way that this is growing and scaling is that leaders from different sectors, in a country, in a community, in a city, have decided that this is right and this is important. How that then grows and scales, I think is dependent on us to decide. There is not an overarching agency necessarily drive. Maybe there should be. Maybe that's what we think should happen over time. But I think part of it is having a conversation as a community to think about how that grows. And we've had a bunch of experience. Another team that I oversee is related to civic tech and civic technology. And it's really a whole space that's grown in its current form and iteration over the last 7 or 8 years. But there's an organization in the United States, Code for America. It works around the world, but Code for America that has been sort of growing city by city. And they have brigades in different cities who are doing hackathons to work on social issues, and they're kind of sharing information.
And Code for America does what?
And Code for America is a nonprofit organization that is looking at how civic technology can be used how technology can be used in innovative ways to solve social problems.
Okay.
And it really is their growth model, their scale has been sort of independent brigades across the country. They can kind of decide how they operate, but they share a lot of information and they think about how to reach into other communities all the time. But it has been there's an overarching small team, but it's been completely driven by the people who get it across the ground. And so what's interesting about a conference like this is to think about, if we really believe in this, and there's a couple of countries in Latin America who are engaged because there's been leadership from wherever sector and whatever government agencies as well that's come from, how do we then get it as a community into other communities across Latin America in a way that's culturally appropriate, in a way that looks at best practices and similar parallels, and that we can show sort of playbooks of how a community would do this, what leadership is needed, et cetera. I mean, I think it's incumbent on us to have that dialogue and discussion.
So it sounds like there are different approaches. There's command and control, where it can be a top-down effect. There's a central entity that looks to see what's working in a certain pilot region and then plucks it and then tries to disperse it. The other is let 1,000 flowers bloom, put something out there and see who takes it, innovates with it, and goes with it. Does it matter which approach to take? Is one more successful than the other?
And let me just add, and sometimes it's partnership agencies, like there might be other organizations that have the reach or the scale already in, and you plug into that and you partner. I mean, I think there are not just top down and bottom up, but I think there's other ways to come in at the side. But I didn't mean to jump in right away.
No, that's you're right. And actually, looking at the more and more complex issue that we need to solve as societies and businesses, then the new models, how you cooperate and solve issues would be changing, and there is no one solution for that. And actually, we've been looking also very often at one of the most advanced forms of cooperation, which is among competitors, when they see the same issue, and they, even though they are, for instance, business competitors, just come together and work on a solution, especially in the automotive industry. It happens quite a lot. So, probably we still need a scale and need to apply those models to the specific items, but the models are, the opportunities to really explore and just have it scale.
And to add, I think you also have a middle, like a midway between bottom-up and top-down. For example, if you have this organization that has tested a model that knows it very well, but then wants to scale it or replicate it in a different context, which would be like the grassroots, the new organization or government in the other context have all this information about how to best adapt it. So you have the organization that pioneered the model, that has all this know-how that can bring it, but then you have to have this dialogue on how could we adapt this model that we have proved, we understand it, why it works, but there are different constraints in the new context where we want to apply it. And this can be locally, this can be another country. You can think about this new context differently, but definitely, I wouldn't say there is one or the other. There is definitely a dialogue between the two that needs to start.
So I still want to understand, though. I mean, what makes something that's less command and control more successful? I mean, if you want to put something out there, and Sid, you've done this, obviously, give us an example of how that has worked. Where has it been applied?
You're talking about when it's bottom up? Well, it's been raised a couple of times in different sessions over the last couple of days that people don't like to be told what to do, especially if they're coming from an outside context or another community and told how to solve your problems. And I think just in general in the scaling conversation here, if you're a neighboring country, or definitely if you come from a different part of the world, or if you're coming from if there are power dynamics in a more affluent community and some other things, and you're going into a community and thinking that you can give them a model to solve their problems, so often that is met with resistance, right? Even if you have the data. I was at if some of you may have been there, at the UN's first World Data Forum that just had in South Africa, speaking there, and there were all these data scientists there from all over the world, in new roles often for agencies, and they again and again kept saying, the most frustrating thing for us is that we are now providing the data. Like, we're collecting it, we're sharing it, but that's not how policymakers are making their decision. Like, we thought that once you have the data, once you see it, now we'll know how to solve problems, but there's context, there's political components, there are all these different factors that go into decision making. And so part of it, going into a community, is not just showing a model and thinking that people will see it and will get it. It's helping them it's helping to have a truly authentic conversation with them, to understand the potential, but then helping them to develop in a way that is culturally or community appropriate. And I think that again and again, when you see that kind of partnership and dialogue from the beginning, you're going to see, you still need leadership. You need people driving, but you're going to see a buy-in and an engagement especially if you're trying to work cross-sector, because the way that academia will engage in that conversation and maybe want to do part of the research on it versus a startup community versus government agencies, et cetera, is their incentives are going to be so different. So you have to understand that from the beginning, have them have buy-in to sort of grow programs that scale in a way that are owned by that community.
So I want to go to Juan Cristobal. I'm going to call on you, and Marcelo, you can probably jump in on this too. In Brazil, we've created an SPI that is more in Sao Paulo, and now we're trying to look at something more broadly. Correct? In Rio, pardon me, Rio, and now we're trying to replicate that across. Will one of you talk to? He's right behind you.
Well,
but what were those factors that made you all look and say, all right, we've done it here. Now there's something here for us to need to be able to build this out further. There's a need for this and an opportunity to scale this more.
All right. I think there's several factors. In SPI specifically, we all depend on the source of information. So the case I presented yesterday was more about a community in Amazonas that were driven, the research was done with questionnaires. So the impact in that community was, we could expect impact only in that community. And then I think, but it would be not enough in just one community. And so after the model was proved, then we can move ahead to other communities. So basically how it works. But in the case of Rio, it was very different because it was built with the mayor of Rio with administrative data. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm sorry, I think I missed the point because it's we need to replicate to reach larger impact, I guess. Mm-hmm. And we need an index to track it, right?
But it's being modeled out in the other communities, correct?
Sorry?
It's being modeled out in a broader part of Brazil.
Yes.
Yes, in other parts. So, Kate, you also had an example from Greece. Or, I'm sorry, did you have a point to add in here, please? And then I want to go to Kate.
Yes, Ladan, but we think that this is not a matter of size, mm-hmm. which is the unit of analysis. Maybe the municipality, a community, or the whole country. It doesn't matter if the intervention is well done. We think scalability as a matter of design, not as a matter of size.
Okay.
So the probability to have an intervention that has the potential to be scaled up mm-hmm. depends on the design, basically.
Okay, which is a point that Ladan made in the beginning too. Is what's the intention from the beginning, and how do you ensure that it's designed right from the beginning to get that impact at the end? I want, in the interest of time, also, I want to go to Kate. There was a project that you all did in Greece.
Cyprus.
Yeah, in Cyprus.
Forgive me. I know we're not supposed to mix them up.
And hence the sort of context of the project. And it really the example pulls on a lot of what you've all said. We were, 2004, there was a referendum, the Anana referendum, to the people of the island of Cyprus about unification. The northern part, the Turkish Cypriot community voted yes. The Greek Cypriot part voted no. And the Greek Cypriot said the reason why we're voting no is because the integration of these two very dissimilar economies will be like East and West, the unification of East and West Germany, and it will be a drag on our economy. Now, whether that was genuine or not, someone said, well, let's take the economic parity issue off the table. So they hired us to go in and help to create the conditions for reunification by driving economic growth in the north. And where it really needed to be driven most, where it didn't have its own legs, was in the rural communities. So we worked with one particular rural community to see if it was possible to actually generate a relatively high-quality ecotourism product. And this community actually approached us and said, this is what we want to do. We thought it had some potential, so we helped them do it. It was very much of a ground-up, sort of bottoms-up endeavor. It turned out to be wildly successful. to the point where several years later I was meeting with mostly women who really drove this entire effort. And she was explaining how it changed her life. But it didn't just change the life of the people within that village and brought back vitality, kept the youth, helped them, really live to their fullest potential. But it also, they became the demonstration project, Laura, to your point, such that other communities all over the island came and said, show us how you did this. And so the conditions for that scalability were, one, about demonstrating success, but two, we didn't have to go out and sell it, nor even show those other villages how to do it, because that first village did. That first village became the replicator. And so the villages that were picking it up and replicating it were actually adapting it to their own needs. And it was an iterative process. Not all villages looked alike. In fact, most of them didn't look alike at all. And then what was interesting is the Greek Cypriot villages said, they got something going on there, let's go take a look at that, and started replicating this same idea all over the southern part of the island. So something that came very much by happenstance actually became more of a unifier between north and south than many of the other well-planned activities that we had chosen. And I think the one thing that, in addition to evidence, in addition to that adaptive must be really owned by those who are implementing it, was knowledge sharing. Was some kind of a knowledge sharing platform, whether it's planned or not planned, I think is absolutely critical to scaling.
So even if it's a dispersed effort that's ground up, there needs to be some mechanism to collect and be able to transfer these issues. I want to ask our attendees and our audience here, how many of you have actual programs right now that you're trying to scale, or endeavors that you're trying to build up? Are there obstacles, or what is it that you need in order to make that happen? Who wants to speak up? Yes.
My name is Hákon Gunnarsson. I'm a local boy.
Hello, local boy. Thank you for hosting us.
Coming from the town, from the municipality of Kópavogur, just here beside Reykjavik. Michael Green has often compared us together with Mexico City. We are around 40,000, but they have 20 million. Says something about scaling, doesn't it?
That does.
But first I would like to, because this conference is coming to an end, thank Michael Green for his organization and his team for this conference, and also on Iceland's behalf, Rosa. But talking about scaling, I think what you're talking about is from local to global. You can also turn this upside down. I mean, it's from global to local, and that's how it looks to us. I mean, we have the social progress index, you have for example, the European Union research, you have the research on and the experience from Paraguay on a landslide scale, and the municipalities from Colombia, etc. What we are planning in Kópavogur about scaling is that we would like to take this even further. For example, how many municipalities are around the size in the world, between 30 and 50,000? There are a lot of them. And it's very important to have the subnational indexes as low as you can, because this is what matters to us all. So I think in all strategic planning you need both. You need top-down, like you said, Ladan, and you need bottom-up, like the approaches you mentioned. But this is something I would like maybe you to elaborate on. Okay?
Very good. So you're looking for peers. You're going to seed. You're going to be, as we like to call it, beachheads, having beachheads in different places to then be able to replicate outwards. There was somebody else who was going to share with us what you need in terms of the scaling. Ahmed, are you stretching, or are you? We have one right here. Yes.
My name is David Whitesock with Face It Together in South Dakota, USA. And kind of off of your point, I'll use a different term, in champions. So we're a local community-based organization. trying to address a drug and alcohol addiction using peers at a hub to break away the barriers, the physical and psychological, to navigate through a very navigational system. So how do you get one person to all these various areas? Well, you've got to have all of those pieces connected. Forget about how you finance that. We've figured that out. But in order to get to the next community, because we have really good results, you need somebody in that next community, one that gets what you're doing, isn't worried about the politics of a really difficult territorial space, mental health and drug addiction, which is limited in sources that come from the public sector, and someone who is willing to take a chance and stand up in front of that community as the champion, the face and voice in their local community to say, we need this because everything else has failed. That's hard for people to do. And I think really good organizations who have something that really works can't take their work elsewhere because there's that fear. And so we run into that in nearly every community that we go to, and the majority of time that we spend in the 6 to 9 months to scale out to a new community is actually in a lot of back rooms, getting a lot of people convinced that they can be that face and voice for their community to bring in something new that can work.
That's a really terrific point. You're right. You know, having amplifiers and people who speak on your behalf, but also speaking to failure is really important. The CASE Foundation in the U.S. actually did some, simple work around failure, and so they have a motto that is: be fearless, fail forward, fail fast, and share your failures. I want to thank our panel. I know that coming after rock stars is really hard, but I think they did a great job in terms of sharing their experiences. And in particular, Sid, I know that we had to ask you to act in kind of schizophrenically with dual personality being on both sides as well. Laura, thank you very much. And indeed, also thank you, Rafal.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to ask everybody to help me out because I think it's really, really important to capture moments in time. And so in the spirit of what we've been doing all along, and I know it's like an Ellen moment or an Academy Awards moment, but I really want to take a selfie. Can we take a selfie, Michael? Do you mind? Come on. All right, everybody get up. Get up. Come on. Let's get in. Come on up. You come up here.
There we go.
Yeah,
Good.
a little bit of a way.
I need to get up. Okay.
There you go.
All right. Everybody in? Come on now. Squeeze in. Hold on. All right. Now, smile. Say, progress.
Progress.
Come on, gotta take a few more. Get happy. Arms up. Be funky. That's progress.
That's good.
All right. Thanks, everybody.